Mom, Leo and I were talking and it just makes sense. My daughter Jessica's voice was breezy, like she was asking me to pick up milk from the store. We'll use your backyard for his 40th birthday bash, and you can just cover the caterer. It'll be perfect for schmoozing investors. I held the phone, a cold silence hanging in my kitchen. Then came the line that landed like a punch. Think of it, she chirped, as your down payment on his new company. A down payment. After everything I'd done, I had been reduced to an initial investment for my son-in-law's next fantasy project. That was the moment the lifetime of accounts I'd kept in my head suddenly came due. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. That foundation hadn't always been cracked. For 30 years, I was the one who built things. Not with bricks and mortar, but with numbers. I was a bookkeeper for half the small businesses in Scottsdale. I balanced the dreams of florists, mechanics, and coffee shop owners. I took their chaotic shoeboxes full of receipts and turned them into clean, orderly reports that told them the truth of their lives, where the money was going, where it was coming from, and whether the whole enterprise was built on solid ground or sinking sand. My entire life was about making things add up. My house is a reflection of that. It's not big or fancy, just a 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet subdivision where the HOA has strict rules about lawn maintenance, which suits me just fine. My late husband, Frank, used to joke that my idea of a wild Friday night was reconciling our bank statement down to the penny. He wasn't wrong. Order gave me a sense of peace, a feeling of control in a world that often felt chaotic. After he passed, that need for order became my anchor. Now, at 67, I was officially retired. The final box from my little office downtown was sitting on my dining room table. It was filled with old client files, tax forms from a decade ago, and at the very top, a heavy ceramic mug. It was chipped at the rim, the blue lettering faded from 1,000 dishwasher cycles. It read, "World's Best Bookkeeper." Frank had given it to me the day I opened my own business. He'd filled it with cheap champagne and told me I was the smartest woman he'd ever met. I ran my thumb over the faded letters. He saw me as a partner, an architect of our life. My daughter, Jessica, saw me as a utility, a convenient resource, like the public library or a free ATM. The Arizona sun was already baking the pavement outside, but my air conditioner hummed a quiet, steady tune. My days had a rhythm now. I'd wake up, make coffee in my French press, and drink it from Frank's mug while I read the news on my tablet. Then I'd spend an hour in the garden, tending to the desert roses and succulents that thrived in the dry heat. In the afternoon, I'd swim laps at the community center or browse the aisles at Trader Joe's, buying just enough for myself. It was a small life, but it was mine. I had built it, paid for it, and earned every quiet moment of it. But the quiet was often punctuated by the needs of Jessica and her husband, Leo. The slow crumbling of our foundation hadn't happened with one big earthquake. It was 1,000 tiny tremors. A text message. "Mom, my card got declined at the pump. Can you Zelle me $50? An offhand comment during a visit. "We'd love to have a new patio set, but with Leo's startup, things are just so tight." A photo album on the coffee table showed them smiling in Cancun on their much-needed getaway, a trip I knew was funded by a check I'd written to them for a leaky roof that never seemed to get fixed. Each time, I'd feel a small, sharp pain, a tiny debit in the emotional ledger I kept in my heart. I'd swallow my questions, telling myself that families help each other. I'd remember Jessica as a little girl with scraped knees, needing my help. But she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a 34-year-old woman who had learned that the magic words, "I need you, Mom," could solve any financial problem she had. That afternoon, after the phone call about the down payment, I walked through my house, and it felt different. The sunlight slanting through the blinds seemed to illuminate a lifetime of transactions. I saw the comfortable guest room where Leo had lived for 3 months, rent-free. After his last business venture, the gourmet food truck had gone belly up. I saw the big screen TV in the living room, my Christmas gift to them 2 years ago because their old one was too small. I walked into my office, the one I was slowly converting into a craft room for myself. On the desk was a stack of my own bills, paid on time, every time. My Social Security statement sat next to a modest investment portfolio I had painstakingly built over 40 years. This was my security, this was my independence, and they saw it as their slush fund. I picked up the bookkeeper mug again, its weight familiar in my hands. Frank had respected my mind, my skill with numbers. He saw my prudence as a strength. Leo saw it as a resource to be tapped. He was all vision and no follow-through, a man who spoke in buzzwords and lived on other people's money. And he had taught my daughter to see her own mother not as a person, but as a column of assets waiting to be liquidated. I placed the mug back on the table. The small, solid clink was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a final entry being made in a ledger that was about to be closed for good. That final, solid clink was the sound of an account being closed. And just like clockwork, the debtors arrived the next day to try and open a new line of credit. I saw their gleaming white SUV pull into my driveway, a car I knew for a fact I'd helped them make the down payment on 3 years ago. The doors opened and out stepped Jessica, my daughter, and Leo, my son-in-law, the visionary. Leo was dressed not for a casual Saturday visit, but for a keynote speech. He wore a crisp salmon-colored polo shirt tucked into white linen trousers and a watch on his wrist that was probably worth more than my first car. His cologne arrived in the house a full 3 seconds before he did, a sharp, aggressive scent that was trying way too hard. Jessica trailed behind him, wearing a strained smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She carried a store-bought lemon cake, the classic peace offering of someone who is about to ask for a very big, very unreasonable favor. "Mom, the house looks great," Jessica said, giving me a quick, brittle hug that was more of a shoulder pat. I took the cake from her. "It looks the same as it did last month, honey." We settled in the living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. I went to the kitchen to get us some iced tea, pouring theirs into tall, clear glasses. For myself, I pulled my old, chipped bookkeeper mug from the cupboard. Its familiar weight felt like an anchor in the storm of Leo's ambition that was about to hit. He didn't wait long. After a few pleasantries about the weather, he leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that manic energy he always got when he was about to unveil his next $1,000,000 idea. "Carol," he began, using my first name in that way that was meant to sound modern and respectful, but always felt like he was treating me as a potential investor instead of his mother-in-law. "I am on the verge of something absolutely massive. I'm talking about a paradigm shift in the wellness and leisure vertical." He unrolled a set of glossy architectural drawings across my coffee table, covering a stack of my library books and a photo of Frank and me at the Grand Canyon. The drawings showed a sprawling complex of courts, lounges, and what looked like a juice bar. "Behold," he said, gesturing with a flourish. "The Pickleball Palace. It's not just a club, Carol, it's a curated lifestyle experience. Think of the synergy. We'll have artisanal kombucha on tap, yoga classes at sunrise, and a membership model that targets the high-net-worth demographic. It's the experiential economy, and we are going to be at the forefront." I took a slow sip of my iced tea, the cool ceramic of my mug a stark contrast to the hot air filling my living room. I listened as he threw out more buzzwords: disruptor, scalability, angel investors, a verbal smokescreen designed to hide the fact that, as always, there was no actual money. There was only the idea, and the expectation that someone else would pay for it. I looked over at Jessica. She was watching me, her expression a desperate mix of hope and apology. She was his cheerleader, his co-conspirator, and his primary fundraiser. She'd been playing that role for so long, I don't think she even remembered how to be just my daughter anymore. "The thing is," Leo continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "we need to make a huge splash to attract the right kind of capital. Which brings me to my 40th birthday. Here it comes," I thought. "The pivot. I don't just want a party," he said. "I want a strategic launch event, a showcase. We get all the movers and shakers in Scottsdale here, in a relaxed, impressive setting. We give them a taste of the Pickleball Palace lifestyle." Jessica jumped in, her voice unnaturally bright. "And we thought, what's a more impressive and beautiful setting than your backyard, Mom? It's so perfect. We'd have a big white tent on the lawn, valet parking out front." My gaze drifted to my garden, to the desert roses I had spent years patiently cultivating. I imagined them being trampled by 100 pairs of expensive shoes. I imagined strangers spilling wine on the flagstones Frank and I had laid together one sweltering summer. "And a top-shelf caterer, of course," Leo added smoothly. "To really sell the vision, that's the part we need a little help with. The initial outlay for the event." He sat back, a confident smile on his face, as if he had just offered me an incredible opportunity. The silence in the room was thick. I looked at the glossy drawings of his fantasy palace, then down at the faded blue words on my mug. World's best bookkeeper. A bookkeeper knows that you can't build a palace on a foundation of debt. A bookkeeper knows that a vision without capital is just a hallucination. And a bookkeeper, above all else, knows when an account is hopelessly delinquent. They were both staring at me, their smiles frozen, waiting for me to do what I always did. Sigh, express a few token concerns, and then open my checkbook. I could feel the weight of their combined expectation pressing down on me. But this time, something was different. The numbers were already running in my head: the food truck, the Cancun, emergency, the endless stream of $50 loans that were never repaid. They weren't just asking for money for a party. They were asking me to fund the latest chapter in a long, exhausting story of their financial irresponsibility. I cleared my throat, and they both leaned in slightly. "That's a lot of money, Leo," I said, my voice even and calm. "Let me look at my finances and see what's what." They took my non-answer as a yes. Of course they did. It was the same script we'd been acting out for years. They hugged me, thanked me profusely for considering it, and left the glossy architectural drawings spread across my coffee table like a claim flag on conquered territory. As their white SUV disappeared down the street, I sank back into my armchair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. My eyes fell on the drawings, on the absurdly slick rendering of the pickleball palace, and the echo of my own words. "Let me look at my finances" triggered a wave of nausea. It wasn't just a phrase, it was the opening line to a tragedy I had already starred in. The memory didn't creep in, it kicked the door down. Suddenly, it was 5 years ago. It wasn't a sunny Saturday, it was a dreary Tuesday in November, with a cold, persistent rain that turned the Scottsdale streets into gray mirrors. The air conditioner in my car was blasting dry heat, but I couldn't stop a shiver from running down my spine. I was parked outside a massive, impersonal bank branch, the kind with more glass and steel than warmth. I was supposed to be meeting Jessica and Leo inside. My stomach was in a tight knot, the same knot I used to get when I knew a client's books were so badly cooked they were about to catch fire. I remember the squeak of my sensible shoes on the polished marble floor and the low, reverent hum of the building. Banks always smell the same, a weird mix of industrial carpet cleaner and old money. Jessica and Leo were already sitting in a pair of stiff leather chairs across from a loan officer's desk. Leo stood up when he saw me, his smile a flash of white in the dim light. He was wearing his big idea suit, a size too tight in the shoulders, and he radiated a desperate confidence. Jessica just looked pale and anxious, twisting a loose thread on her sweater. "Mom, you came," she whispered, as if she'd been sure I wouldn't. The loan officer, a young man named Mr. Davies with tired eyes, gave me a polite, professional smile. He'd already seen their application. He already knew they didn't qualify. I was the missing piece of the puzzle. I was the co-signer. I was the good credit score, the solid assets, the safety net that would make their terrible idea look like a sound investment on paper. "So, Carol," Leo had boomed, his voice too loud for the space. "Jessica told you about our mobile culinary brand, right? The gourmet grilled cheese experience. This isn't just a food truck. We're talking franchise potential within 2 years." I remember looking at the business plan he pushed across the desk. It was full of the same empty buzzwords he used now, just with a different theme. It had pictures of smiling families eating overpriced sandwiches. The numbers were pure fantasy, projections based on nothing but his own boundless optimism. As a bookkeeper, I could see the gaping holes in it. The overhead was too high, the profit margins were razor thin, and he'd budgeted nothing for maintenance, insurance, or the slow winter months. It was a business plan designed to fail. "It's a big risk, Leo," I had said, my voice quiet. "Every great American success story starts with a big risk," he'd countered, leaning forward. "This is our shot. Jess believes in it. Don't you, honey?" He didn't look at her, but Jessica dutifully nodded. "I do, Mom. I really do. We need you to believe in it, too." Her eyes pleaded with me. Back then, that was enough to break me. The fear of disappointing my only child was a greater liability than any bad loan. So I sat down. Mr. Davies slid the stack of documents toward me, the paper crisp and cool to the touch. He uncapped a heavy, expensive-looking pen and pointed to the first yellow tab. "Sign here, Mrs. Peterson." My hand trembled slightly as I took the pen. I could feel Frank's presence in that room, a ghost of good sense shaking his head. He had always been the dreamer, but I had been the realist who made sure our dreams were solvent. What would he think of me now, underwriting this disaster? But then I looked at Jessica, at her hopeful, desperate face, and I signed my name. My signature was neat, professional, the same one I'd used to certify thousands of accurate financial statements. This was the first time I had ever put it on a document I knew, in my gut, was based on a lie. "And here," Mr. Davies said, sliding the next page over, "and initial here and here." With each stroke of the pen, I felt like I was giving away a piece of the future Frank and I had built. The down payment on our first house, the savings for Jessica's college fund, the nest egg for our own retirement. It was all there, in the form of my good name, now legally bound to a grilled cheese truck. When it was over, the relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. They both hugged me, their thanks a flurry of rushed words. They were so excited, so focused on their new future, that they barely seemed to notice the weight that had just settled onto my shoulders. They practically skipped out of the bank into the rain, leaving me to exchange a final, weary glance with Mr. Davies. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both knew what had just happened. The truck was a flash in the pan. For 6 months it was a novelty. Then the repairs started. The generator failed. The grill broke. Leo complained about the long hours and the price of artisanal bread. By the 8th month, it was parked behind their apartment, gathering dust. And on the first day of the 10th month, the payment book from the bank arrived quietly in my mailbox, addressed to me. He had defaulted. I never said a word to them about it. I just set up an automatic payment from my own checking account and paid it off, month after month, for the next 4 years. I paid for their dream, and then I paid for their failure. The memory receded, leaving me back in my quiet living room, the late afternoon sun warming my face. I stared at the glossy drawings of the pickleball palace. It was the food truck all over again, just with more courts and a bigger price tag. But something was different this time. The woman who had sat in that bank 5 years ago, trembling and afraid to say no, was gone. In her place was a bookkeeper who had finally decided it was time to audit her own life. And this time, there would be no co-signing. This time, the books were going to balance. The thought was so clear, so final, it felt like a command. I didn't get up to clear away their glasses or fold the throw blanket on the couch. I left their glossy proposal sitting on my coffee table, a monument to their audacity. The memory of that cold, rainy day at the bank had burned away the last of my maternal instinct to protect them from themselves. Protection had become enabling, and my love had been mistaken for an endless line of credit. Sleep was out of the question. An old energy, the kind I used to get before a big, complicated year-end audit, was humming through my veins. I walked into my small office and switched on the desk lamp, creating a single pool of light in the quiet darkness of my house. The screen of my laptop glowed to life, reflecting in my tired eyes. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee, strong and black, and poured it into my world's best bookkeeper mug. This wasn't for comfort. This was for fuel. I was going to work. For 30 years I had audited other people's lives. I had sifted through their financial histories, followed the trails of their spending, and presented them with the unvarnished truth of their balance sheets. Tonight, I was going to do it for myself. I sat down, my fingers finding their familiar place on the keyboard. I logged into my bank's website, the two-factor authentication code buzzing on my phone with its usual electronic chirp. It was a mundane, everyday action, but tonight it felt like turning a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. I navigated to the transaction history page. Most people only look back a month or two. I clicked the option for a custom date range. Start date: 8 years ago, the month Jessica and Leo got married. End date: today. The system whirred for a moment, processing a request it probably rarely received. Then, I clicked the button that said Export to CSV. A small file downloaded to my computer. I opened it. A vast, intimidating grid of numbers and words filled the screen, thousands of rows, each one a single financial transaction, a single moment in my life. A receipt for a life I hadn't fully realized I was living. I began to build my ledger. Column A, date. Column B, description. Column C, amount. And the most important one, column D, category. I created 3 categories: household, personal, and the one that mattered, Jessica and Leo. Then, I started to sort. The work was methodical, painstaking, and utterly hypnotic. Line by line, I went back in time, assigning each debit to its proper place. The first few years were small things, the kind of help any mother would give. $100 here for a bridesmaid dress, $50 there for a new tire. I categorized them, my heart aching with the memory of a younger, more hopeful me, a me who thought this was just temporary help for a young couple getting on their feet. But as I scrolled through the years, the entries grew larger and more frequent. The clicking of my mouse became the soundtrack to a slow-dawning horror. Zelle to Jessica. Groceries, $250. Every month for the last year. Venmo to Leo. Car trouble. $800. I remembered that call. He'd sounded so panicked. The recurring monthly charge for their Amazon Prime account, linked to my credit card. I saw the endless stream of small purchases, diapers for their dog, video games for Leo, clothes for Jessica, all shipped to their address, all paid for by me. The Uber Eats charges, sometimes 2 or 3 a night. While I was at home eating a simple salad, they were ordering sushi and pizza on my dime. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my old professional instincts taking over. With each line I categorized, the narrative of the last 8 years became brutally clear. I wasn't their mother, I was their primary source of income. I was the silent, uncredited backer of their lifestyle. I reached the line item for the down payment on their white SUV. $5,000. I remembered Jessica crying on the phone, saying they couldn't get approved without more cash up front. Then came the Home Depot charge for their leaky roof, $3,200. I recalled Leo telling me how he was going to fix it himself to save money. And then, the darkest entries of all, the 48 consecutive monthly payments to the bank for the failed food truck loan. The sun was starting to tinge the edges of my blinds with a pale gray light. My coffee was cold, my eyes burned from staring at the screen. I had categorized the final entry. I scrolled to the bottom of the Jessica and Leo column. My hand was shaking now, not from fatigue, but from a cold, quiet rage that had been building with every keystroke. I highlighted the entire column, from the first $50 loan to last week's grocery bill. My cursor hovered over the sigma symbol at the top of the screen. The sum function. I clicked it. The number that appeared in the box at the bottom of the screen made me gasp. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush, as if I'd been physically struck. It was a number that represented a new car, a trip around the world, a kitchen remodel, a lifetime of security. It was a number that represented years of my discipline, my hard work, my sacrifice. And I had given it away, piece by piece, without ever stopping to count the cost. I stared at the number, the sum total of my own foolishness, of their bottomless entitlement. For a moment, I felt a wave of shame so profound it was dizzying. Then, the bookkeeper in me took over. Shame was an emotion. This was a number, and numbers were not emotional. They were facts. With a final, decisive click, I formatted the cell. I made the font bold. I changed the color to a deep, unforgiving red. I added the $sign. I saved the file to my desktop, naming it with a simple, damning title, the J&L account. Then, I hit print. The printer whirred to life in the quiet of the morning, spitting out a single, clean sheet of paper. I picked it up. It was still warm. On it, in neat columns, was the story of the last 8 years of my life. It was no longer a vague feeling of being taken for granted. It was an invoice, and it was long past due. An invoice, long past due. I stood in my silent office, the single sheet of paper in my hand feeling heavier than a stack of legal documents. For a lifetime, I had operated on feelings, on love, on a mother's unwritten obligation to her child. But feelings can be manipulated. Love can be taken for granted. This piece of paper, however, was different. It was fact. It was a balance sheet of my heart, and it showed a catastrophic loss. A part of me, a deeply ingrained part that had been conditioned for decades, felt a pang of guilt. The numbers felt like an accusation, and I was accusing my own daughter. The thought of confronting her with this cold, hard document made me feel like a monster. Was I being selfish? Unforgiving? I folded the paper into a neat square and tucked it into my purse. For 30 years I had been my own counsel, trusting my own judgment, but this time I needed a second opinion. I needed an external auditor. I called Sharon. We'd been friends for 20 years, meeting after our husbands passed and bonding over the shared, strange experience of navigating the world as widows. She was a retired nurse, pragmatic and unsentimental, with a finely tuned nonsense detector. If I was being unreasonable, she would tell me. We met at Panera Bread, that uniquely American purgatory of lunch. It smelled of warm broccoli, cheddar soup, and burnt coffee. We found a booth in the corner, the green vinyl cool against my skin. Sharon unwrapped her turkey Bravo sandwich and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "Okay, Carol," she said, her voice low. "You look like you just audited the mob. What's wrong?" I didn't launch into the whole story. I didn't talk about the pickleball palace or the down payment. I just opened my purse, took out the folded sheet of paper, and slid it across the table next to her half-eaten sandwich. I ran the numbers. I said simply. She picked it up, her brow furrowed in confusion. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the columns. I watched her face, a landscape of shifting emotions. First curiosity, then disbelief. As her eyes widened slightly, her gaze slowed, and she started tracing the lines with her manicured fingernail, her lips moving silently as she read the descriptions. Zelle to Jessica. Venmo to Leo. Amazon Prime. I saw her jaw tighten. The transformation was complete when she got to the final bolded number at the bottom of the page. She let out a low whistle and placed the paper down on the table with a quiet finality, as if it were a damning piece of evidence in a courtroom. She was silent for a long time, just looking from the paper back to my face. I braced myself for her judgment, for her to tell me I was being petty, that this is just what families do. Instead, she reached across the table and put her warm hand over mine. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "This isn't a ledger. This is a crime scene." A tear I hadn't even realized I was holding back slid down my cheek. The relief was so sudden, so total, it felt like a dam had broken inside me. I just kept telling myself it was helping. I whispered, my voice thick, that they were just getting on their feet. Getting on their feet. Sharon scoffed, pulling her hand back and leaning forward. "Carol, they're not getting on their feet. They're standing on your shoulders. This isn't helping. This is enabling. There's a huge difference." She picked up the paper again, waving it slightly. "Helping is teaching your kid to ride a bike. Enabling is buying them a brand new car every time they crash the old one because they refuse to learn how to drive. Helping is giving them a hand up. Enabling is letting them use you as a stepping stool." Her words were so clear, so direct. They cut through the fog of guilt and obligation that had clouded my thinking for years. She was taking my vague feelings of being used and giving them a name, a definition. "But she's my daughter, Sharon," I said, the old excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. "Exactly," she said, her gaze intense. "She's your daughter, not your dependent. She's a grown woman with a husband, and you, my friend, are her mother, not her bank." Somewhere along the line, it seems like everyone forgot that, including you. She was right. In my desperate attempt to be a good, supportive mother, I had forgotten to teach my daughter the most important lesson of all, responsibility. I had shielded her from the natural consequences of her and her husband's poor decisions, and in doing so, I had crippled her. My love had become a liability. "Leo wants me to fund his 40th birthday party," I said, the whole absurd story spilling out of me now. "He wants me to pay for a caterer and a tent so he can impress investors for his new big idea, a pickleball club." Sharon actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Of course he does. Why would he use his own money when he's got you? You're the best angel investor a guy like that could ask for. All of the investment, none of the accountability." I looked down at the invoice sitting on the table between us. It wasn't a document of my pettiness. It was a record of my silence. Every line item represented a time I didn't say no, a time I didn't set a boundary, a time I valued their temporary happiness over my own long-term security. I folded the paper back up, the creases sharp and exact, and put it back in my purse. It felt different now. It was no longer a source of shame. It was a declaration. Sharon watched me, her expression knowing. She took a sip of her iced tea, the ice cubes clinking against the plastic cup. "So," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "the question isn't what they want you to do, Carol. We know the answer to that. The question is, what are you going to do now?" I met her gaze across the table, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel conflicted or guilty. I felt a sense of calm, of absolute, unshakable clarity. I smiled, a small, slow smile that started at the corners of my mouth and worked its way up to my eyes. The books were about to be balanced, and the final audit was going to be a masterpiece. That smile stayed on my face all the way out of Panera Bread. The final audit was going to be a masterpiece, and every masterpiece begins with a single, bold stroke. I didn't drive home. The flimsy invoice in my purse felt like it was burning a hole through the leather, demanding to be converted from a record of past debts into an asset for the future. I turned my car away from my quiet subdivision and headed toward the interstate, toward the part of town where giant American flags flapped over acres of asphalt lots. I pulled into the dealership, a vast, shimmering sea of recreational vehicles. It was a city of fiberglass and chrome, baking under the relentless Arizona sun. There were monstrous Class A motorhomes that looked like tour buses for rock stars, and giant fifth-wheel trailers that seemed bigger than my actual house. A young salesman in a polo shirt with a dealership logo embroidered on the chest intercepted me before I even took 5 steps. "Afternoon, ma'am. Kyle here. Looking to upgrade the old homestead?" he asked, his smile a little too wide, his eyes already sizing me up as a lonely widow who was probably just killing time. "I'm looking for something specific," I said, my voice firm, cutting through his rehearsed patter. "Absolutely. We've got a beautiful 40-foot pinnacle with 5 slide-outs, a fireplace, and a residential-sized fridge. Perfect for having the grandkids over," he said, already steering me toward one of the behemoths. "No," I said, stopping in my tracks. He looked surprised. "That's not for me. That's someone else's house on wheels. I'm looking for a way to move through the world, not a way to drag my whole life behind me." I scanned the rows, my eyes passing over the endless white boxes, and then I saw it, tucked away at the end of a row, gleaming like a polished jewel. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest. It was classic. It was an Airstream. Its body was a beautiful, riveted aluminum shell, curved and sleek, reflecting the harsh sunlight in a soft, silvery glow. It looked less like a trailer and more like a piece of vintage aviation, a silver bullet ready to fly. "That one," I said, pointing. Kyle's professional smile faltered for a second. "The Globetrotter? It's a great little unit, but it's a bit more compact. The Pinnacle has a king-sized bed." "I don't need a king-sized bed," I said, walking toward it, my purse clutched in my hand. He unlocked the door, and I stepped inside. The interior smelled of new wood and clean metal, not the cloying plastic scent of the other RVs. Everything was clever, efficient, and beautifully designed. A curved dinette with panoramic windows looked out onto the blazing hot asphalt, but I could picture it looking out onto the Grand Canyon, or the pine forests of Oregon, or the rocky coast of Maine. I ran my hand over the smooth countertop of the small galley kitchen. I imagined making coffee for myself, just myself, while watching the sunrise in a national park. Frank and I had always talked about this. "Someday, Carol," he would say, "we'll sell the house, buy one of these things, and just go, see everything." But someday was always a moving target, a vague destination on a map we never got around to drawing. Life, and then death, had gotten in the way. Leo's glossy drawings of his pickleball palace flashed in my mind, a fantasy built on my money. This Airstream, this was different. It was solid. It was real. It was Frank's dream, but it was about to be my reality. I stepped out into the blinding sunlight, my decision made. "I'll take it," I said. Kyle blinked. You don't want to think about it? Maybe run the numbers." I almost laughed. "I've already run the numbers," I said. "Trust me, they work out perfectly." We went inside to his small, air-conditioned office. The walls were covered in photos of him shaking hands with smiling couples in front of massive RVs. He placed a stack of documents in front of me, the same way Mr. Davies had at the bank all those years ago. But this time, there was no knot in my stomach. There was no hesitation. The pen he handed me felt light in my hand. When we got to the down payment section, I didn't flinch. I wrote out the check, my handwriting as neat and steady as ever. The amount was substantial. It was enough to cover the caterer, the big white tent, the valet parking, and 1,000 gallons of artisanal kombucha for Leo's party. It was the exact amount of their down payment, repurposed. My signature on that loan document was an act of sacrifice. My signature on this purchase agreement was an act of salvation. An hour later, I was standing in the vast, empty parking lot, the heat radiating up from the pavement. The dealership was closing, and the last of the employees were driving away. In front of me sat my Airstream, hitched to my car, the silver bullet of my own liberation. It wasn't just a trailer. It was a promise. It was the physical manifestation of a boundary I had finally drawn. It was the most beautiful, most expensive, most glorious no a woman had ever uttered. I got in my car, the keys to my new life feeling solid and real in my hand. I looked at the Airstream in my rearview mirror. I had taken the funds they saw as their entitlement and invested them in my own escape. The audit was complete. Now, it was time to deliver the annual report. I spent the next 2 days preparing. Not just my house, but myself. Every time the phone rang with Jessica's number, I let it go to voicemail. "Just checking in, Mom," her bright, false voice would say. "So, can't wait to hear the good news about the party." I deleted the messages without listening to the end. I was a bookkeeper preparing for a shareholder meeting where I was the sole shareholder and the board of directors was about to be fired. When they arrived on Sunday afternoon, I was ready. The house was spotless. I had made a pitcher of iced tea and set out a plate of lemon cookies, the picture of domestic tranquility. But there was one thing that was different. My large-screen television, usually dark, was glowing with the cool blue and white grid of an Excel spreadsheet. They walked in, Leo striding ahead, radiating confidence. He'd already spent the money in his head a dozen times over. Jessica followed, a little more hesitant, but her eyes were bright with anticipation. They were here to collect. "Mom, hi," Jessica said, kissing the air near my cheek. "Smells great in here. Did you bake?" "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the sofa that faced the television. "I have something to show you." They sat down, Leo sprawling comfortably, Jessica perched on the edge of the cushion. They glanced at the screen, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. "Is your computer broken?" Leo asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. "No," I said, picking up the remote control from the coffee table. "It's working perfectly. I told you I would look at my finances. I've prepared a brief summary." I clicked a button, and the cursor moved to the top of the spreadsheet. The title of the document, the J&L Account, 8-Year Summary, was displayed in a clean, bold font at the top. I saw Jessica's smile falter. I took a breath and began. My voice was calm, even, the same voice I had used to present financial reports for 30 years. There was no anger, no accusation, just facts. "I've broken down the last 8 years of financial support into several key categories for clarity," I said, using the remote to highlight the first column. This first column represents direct cash transfers, funds sent via Zelle, Venmo, or direct deposit, largely for what were termed emergencies or short-term loans. The number at the bottom of the column was just over $9,000. Leo shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "This next column," I continued, moving the cursor over, "tracks all recurring payments and subscriptions managed on your behalf. Amazon Prime, cell phone bills for the first 2 years of your marriage, car insurance payments, and so on." I didn't need to look at them to feel the atmosphere in the room changing. The air was growing heavy, thick with a silence they didn't know how to fill. "And this column, this one is a bit more extensive." I highlighted the third column, the longest one. "This tracks all retail and service purchases, items purchased on my credit or debit cards for your use. This includes everything from Uber Eats and groceries delivered to your apartment to larger assets." I slowly scrolled down the list of transactions, letting the descriptions hang in the air. The down payment for the SUV, the charges from Home Depot for the leaky roof, the copay for Leo's emergency root canal. I paused, letting them absorb the sheer volume of the list. Jessica was staring at the screen, her face as white as a sheet. She looked like she was going to be sick. Leo was no longer lounging. He was sitting bolt upright, his jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping slightly. This last column reflects the payments made to satisfy the defaulted loan on the gourmet grilled cheese food truck. I highlighted the final column, the one with the 48 identical payments, the one that was a monument to my silence. Then, I scrolled to the very bottom of the page, to the grand total. The number was in a large, bold, red font. It glowed from the 60-inch screen, illuminating their stunned faces. I let it sit there, in the dead quiet of my living room, for a full minute. The only sound was the faint hum of the television. The number didn't need any explanation. It spoke for itself. Finally, I turned off the spreadsheet, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a dim, heavy twilight. I turned to face them. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, shame, and a dawning, panicked anger. They had been exposed, not by a hysterical mother's accusations, but by their own transaction history, by the simple, brutal truth of arithmetic. I leaned forward, placing my hands on my knees. "You came here today to ask me for a down payment," I said, my voice still quiet, still controlled. "An investment in your future." I looked from Jessica's horrified face to Leo's furious one. "After reviewing the 8-year performance of this account," I continued, "I've concluded that it is no longer a viable investment for me. The return on investment has been, to put it mildly, unsustainable." I let the business jargon, his own empty language, hang in the air between us. "So," I said, delivering the final line of my report, "I've liquidated my position. I've moved the capital into a new asset with a guaranteed return on happiness." I stood up. "It's parked in the driveway if you'd like to see it." For a long moment, nobody moved. The black screen of the television was like a void that had sucked all the sound and energy from the room. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, Leo stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked at Jessica, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. He jerked his head toward the front door, a silent, furious command. Jessica, looking dazed and fragile, stumbled to her feet and followed him. I walked after them, stopping at the threshold of my own front door, and watched them. I was the bookkeeper, observing the fallout after a hostile takeover. The late afternoon sun was low in the sky, and it caught the polished aluminum of the Airstream, making it glow with an almost ethereal light. It sat there in my driveway, hitched to my car, looking beautiful, serene, and unbothered. It was the physical embodiment of the number they had just seen on the screen, a gleaming 3-ton monument to my final answer. They both stopped dead on the walkway, staring at it. Jessica made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat, like a whimpering animal. Leo just stared, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The reality of the situation was crashing down on them, not in the abstract numbers of a spreadsheet, but in the solid, undeniable fact of 28 feet of riveted metal that was not, and would never be, theirs. Leo was the first to break the paralysis. He whipped his smartphone out of his pocket with a vicious snap of his wrist. His thumb jabbed at the screen. I watched from the doorway as he began to dismantle his dream, one phone call at a time. His voice was a low, strained murmur, tight with a rage he was trying to suppress. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I didn't need to. I knew who he was calling: the caterer, the valet service, the company that rented out the big white tents for parties. He paced back and forth on my perfectly manicured lawn, his expensive linen trousers brushing against the sprinkler heads. With every call, another piece of his grand vision, his strategic launch event, evaporated into the dry desert air. This was the other side of the ledger, the part he never wanted to think about. This was the consequence. Jessica, meanwhile, seemed to crumple. She leaned against the side of their SUV, the one with the tires I'd paid for, and slid down until she was sitting on the hot pavement, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with ragged, heartbroken sobs. "I can't believe she did this to us," she wailed, her voice muffled. "How could she be so cruel, after everything, to ruin your birthday?" Leo finished his last call and jabbed the end button with his thumb as if he were trying to break the screen. He turned, not to comfort his weeping wife, but to loom over her, his face dark with contempt. "My birthday," he snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl. "You think this was about my birthday? This was about my one shot, my one chance to get real players, real money in a room, and it's gone, evaporated. She ruined it, Jessica sobbed. My own mother. And then came the words that told me everything I ever needed to know about my son-in-law, about the man my daughter had married, about the true nature of their partnership. No, Leo spat, pointing a trembling finger at her. You ruined it. This is your fault. I told you to handle her. I told you your mom was smarter than you gave her credit for. Your one job was to manage your mother, to keep the asset liquid. And you failed. An asset. That's all I had ever been to him. A resource on a balance sheet that Jessica had failed to properly manage. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. There was no pain, no anger. It was just clarity. The final, brutal truth of the audit. Jessica looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of shocked betrayal. My fault. You're the one who spent every last dime she gave us on your stupid schemes. They were investments, he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet suburban street. Investments you were supposed to secure the funding for, but you got complacent. You thought the bank of Mom would never close. I watched them tear each other apart right there on my driveway, their whispers turning into shouts, their accusations flying like poisoned arrows. They were a party of two, celebrating the spectacular bankruptcy of their own marriage. I had a feeling this was a conversation they had been needing to have for a very long time. Finally, the anger burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of their failure. Leo wrenched the passenger door of the SUV open. Get in, he muttered, not looking at her. Jessica, weeping silently now, pulled herself up and got in, slamming the door behind her. Leo stomped around to the driver's side and threw himself into the seat. For a moment, they just sat there in the car I had helped them buy, two silent strangers in a capsule of shared resentment. Then, with a roar of the engine and a squeal of tires on my clean concrete, they were gone. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the cicadas starting their evening song and the soft ticking of my car's engine as it cooled. I stood in my doorway for a long time, watching the dust settle. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel happy. I felt balanced. The accounts had been reconciled. The toxic assets had been liquidated. I walked out into the warm twilight and placed my hand on the cool, smooth flank of the Airstream. It was solid beneath my palm. It was real. The storm was over, and in its place, a quiet, peaceful, and profound independence had finally begun. The silence that followed their chaotic departure was the most profound peace I had felt in years. It was the quiet of a fever that has finally broken, the calm after a violent storm has passed. A profound, unshakable independence had finally begun, and its first gift was this silence. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, carried it out to the back patio, and sat in the gathering twilight. I watched the stars begin to prick the deep purple of the desert sky. I didn't think about Jessica or Leo. I thought about the road. I thought about the places I would go, the things I would see. For the first time, the future felt like an open map instead of a ledger of obligations. Of course, I knew it wasn't truly over. An audit this significant was bound to have aftershocks. They came the next morning, in the form of a ringing telephone that shattered the peaceful quiet. I looked at the caller ID. Maria Rinaldi, Leo's mother. I felt a familiar flicker of dread, the old instinct to placate, to smooth over, to manage the emotions of everyone around me. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and let that instinct die. Hello, Maria, I said, my voice as calm and pleasant as if she were calling to wish me a happy birthday. Carol, what in God's name did you do? Her voice was a shrill wave of accusation. Leo called me last night, absolutely beside himself. He said you humiliated him. You dangled this party in front of him and then snatched it away. What kind of cruel game are you playing? I listened patiently, letting her vent. I pictured her in her overly decorated house across town, clutching her phone, spoiling for a fight. The old me would have gotten defensive. The old me would have launched into a tearful, detailed explanation of every injustice, trying to win her over, to make her see my side. The new me didn't have the time or the energy for that. The new me dealt in facts. There was no game, Maria, I said when she finally paused for breath. My voice was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Then what do you call it? She demanded. He's heartbroken, his one big chance to launch his business, and his own mother-in-law sabotages it. I let a bead of silence hang in the air, a tactic I'd learned from years of dealing with emotional clients. Let them fill the void. But this time, I filled it myself, with a single, devastating truth. "Maria," I said, my tone still even, still professional. "I paid for your son's dream for 8 years. The line went completely silent. I could hear the faint hum of the connection, but from her end, nothing. I had expected her to argue, to interrupt, but my statement was so direct, so irrefutable, it had stunned her. I continued into the void. "I'm just sorry he never learned how to fund it himself." I paused, letting the implication land. Then, I delivered the final, quiet blow. "I hope you have better luck." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of someone preparing their next attack. It was the silence of someone who had been handed a bill they never expected to pay. I had not only refused to continue being her son's safety net, I had politely and irrevocably handed the job over to her. In 3 short sentences, I had ended a war and redefined an entire family dynamic. "I have to go now, Maria," I said gently. "Have a lovely day." I hung up the phone before she could find her voice. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt light. A burden I didn't even realize I had been carrying. The responsibility for my in-laws' opinion of me had simply vanished. The rest of the day passed in that same quiet peace. I went online and started looking at maps of the national parks. I ordered a book on RV maintenance. I was building my new life, one small, deliberate choice at a time. That evening, as I was washing my dinner dishes, my phone buzzed on the counter. I dried my hands and picked it up, bracing myself. It was a text from Jessica. I expected a novel, a long, scrolling diatribe of accusations and guilt-tripping. Instead, there was only a single word: "Sorry." I stared at that one word for a very long time. It was so small, so inadequate to cover the vast, barren landscape of the last 8 years. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the disrespect or repay the money. It wasn't an apology for what she had done, so much as an acknowledgement of what she had lost. And yet, it was more than I had gotten from her in nearly a decade. The old me would have called her immediately, crying, saying, "It's okay, honey, we can fix this." But I knew that would be a mistake. Fixing this was not my job anymore. The debt between us was no longer financial. It was emotional, and it was hers to repay. This single word was the first, tiny installment. I didn't reply. I simply put the phone back down on the counter, the screen dark. Forgiveness was a long way down the road, a destination I wasn't even sure I wanted to visit yet. For now, it was enough to know that she was finally, for the first time, looking at the bill. The house was quiet again. The phone did not ring. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, truly and completely on my own. It was a beautiful feeling. It was a beautiful feeling. For 2 weeks, I let that feeling soak in, rooting itself in the quiet soil of my new life. I learned the systems of the Airstream, my silver bullet. I practiced backing it into a spot in an empty mall parking lot until the motion felt natural. I packed it not with a lifetime of clutter, but with only the essentials. Sturdy clothes, good hiking shoes, a handful of books I'd always meant to read, and my chipped World's Best Bookkeeper mug. Then, one bright Tuesday morning, with the invoice from my old life filed away and the map of my new one spread out on the passenger seat, I turned the key in the ignition. Pulling out of my driveway, leaving behind the house that had been both my sanctuary and my prison, felt like a ship leaving the harbor for the open sea. The weight of the Airstream behind me was a tangible, reassuring presence. It wasn't a burden. It was my entire self-contained world, my Declaration of Independence rolling along on 2 axles. The first stop was the Grand Canyon. I had lived in Arizona for 40 years and had only ever been once, on a rush trip with Jessica when she was a teenager, a trip where she'd complained about the lack of cell service the entire time. This time, it was different. I found a campsite on the North Rim, away from the biggest crowds. The first morning, I woke up before dawn, made coffee on my small stove, and carried my old, familiar mug to the canyon's edge. As the sun began to rise, it set the vast, silent chasm on fire. Layers of rock glowed in shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. It was a wound in the earth that had been carved out, grain by grain, over millions of years. Standing there, watching that immense silent spectacle, the drama of the last 8 years of my life seemed so small, so insignificant. My ledger of grievances, which had felt so monumental, was just a tiny speck of dust in the face of that geological time. I took a sip of my coffee and felt a lifetime of petty anxieties wash away into the canyon's silent depths. Life on the road found a new rhythm. It wasn't the rigid, predictable rhythm of my old life, but a fluid one, dictated by the sun and the weather and my own whims. My days were no longer measured by phone calls and manufactured emergencies, but by miles driven and wonders seen. I learned the quiet camaraderie of the campground, the unspoken code among travelers. I shared a campfire with a retired couple from Wisconsin who were trying to visit every Major League Baseball stadium. I helped a young family from California figure out their water hookup, and they shared their s'mores with me later that night. We didn't talk about our old lives or our family problems. We talked about the best roads to take through Utah, the worst places to get gas, and the simple shared joy of being free. In Zion National Park, I hiked the Purus Trail along the Virgin River. It was an easy trail, but for me, it felt like climbing a mountain. I could feel the strength in my legs, the sun on my face, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For years, my life had been stationary. I had been a fixed asset, a home base for others to return to when they needed something. Now, I was in motion. I was the one exploring. I was the one moving forward, under my own power. Every step was a declaration that I was no longer waiting for my life to happen. I was living it. I found a surprising joy in the small, mundane tasks of this new life. Plotting my route in a worn Rand McNally road atlas, the crisp rustle of the paper a welcome change from the glow of a screen. The simple satisfaction of perfectly leveling the airstream at a new campsite. The taste of a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake at a dusty roadside diner in the middle of nowhere. These were the small dividends from my new investment, and they were more satisfying than any stock market gain. One afternoon, sitting at a picnic table overlooking a vast, empty stretch of the Nevada desert, I thought about the word selfish. For years, that word had been a cage. It was the word used to keep mothers and wives and women in their place, the threat whispered every time you dared to want something for yourself. My daughter had hurled it at me like a weapon, but out here, under the vast open sky, the word had lost its power. If it was selfish to want my own life back, then I was selfish. If it was selfish to use the money I had earned to build my own dreams instead of funding someone else's fantasies, then I was selfish. If it was selfish to choose the quiet grandeur of a national park over the noisy drama of my family, then I was joyfully, unapologetically, and profoundly selfish. And it felt, for the first time, not like a sin, but like a virtue. It was the simple act of balancing my own books, and finally, putting myself on the asset side of the ledger.